Picture this. It's October 2025, and the longest government shutdown in American history just hit day 40. A scientist at the National Institutes of Health stares at her frozen cancer research, dying in a petri dish because the lab funding ran out. A Coast Guard officer lines up at a food bank to feed his family while still being required to report for duty. The Lincoln Memorial sits locked behind metal barriers like some kind of bureaucratic crime scene. This isn't war. This isn't a natural disaster. This is something far more absurd. This is a country that literally forgot how to pay its own bills. If you want more breakdowns that actually explain how power, money, and politics really work under the hood, hit subscribe now so you don't rely on campaign ads to understand any of this. But here's the twisted part. None of this is an accident. This chaos, this suffering, this complete abandonment of basic governance, it's all totally legal. In fact, it's required by law. Welcome to the most expensive temper tantrum in human history, brought to you by a legal loophole that's been weaponized into a political doomsday device. You're watching the slow-motion collapse of a superpower, one government shutdown at a time. So who's actually to blame for this mess? The answer is going to make you furious, because it's not who you think it is. And once you understand how we got here, you'll realize this story isn't really about the 2025 shutdown at all. It's about how a republic accidentally gave itself a loaded gun and then spent decades teaching its politicians exactly how to use it. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know about government shutdowns. The media loves to frame these as passionate ideological battles between principled politicians fighting for the soul of America. Democrats versus Republicans. Liberals versus conservatives. Good versus evil, depending on which side you're rooting for. This is complete nonsense. The truth is far more pathetic. Government shutdowns aren't noble battles over competing visions of American greatness. They're bureaucratic hostage situations carried out by people who've discovered that threatening to burn down the entire country is an effective way to win arguments they're losing through normal democratic processes. The politicians know this. The media knows this. But they keep selling you the romantic version because the real story makes everyone look like incompetent sociopaths. Which, to be fair, is exactly what they are. Most Americans assume government shutdowns have always been part of our political system. Some necessary safety valve built into the Constitution by the founders, right? Wrong. For nearly 200 years, the American government never shut down in the modern sense. Not once. When politicians argued, which they did constantly, the agencies just kept working. They operated on what you might call institutional faith. The quiet assumption that Congress would eventually pay the bills, even if they took their sweet time arguing about it. It was messy. It was financially questionable. But the republic endured. Federal workers got paid. National parks stayed open. Cancer research continued uninterrupted. Imagine that. Then something changed in 1980. Something that would fundamentally alter American politics forever. And it all started with a memo from a lawyer you've never heard of. His name was Benjamin Civilletti, and he was Attorney General under Jimmy Carter. Civiletti wasn't trying to create a political weapon. He was just doing his job, trying to clean up some loose ends in federal law. He dug up a forgotten piece of legislation from 1870 called the Anti-Deficiency Act. This law was originally designed to stop rogue generals from starting their own wars or building gold-plated offices without congressional permission. Basic post-Civil War housekeeping to prevent military commanders from going crazy with the federal budget. The law said, quite simply, that federal agencies couldn't spend money they didn't have. Civiletti wrote a series of legal opinions interpreting exactly what this meant. His conclusion was bureaucratically logical and politically catastrophic. He argued the law meant exactly what it said. No money means no work. Period. Federal agencies had to shut down operations if Congress failed to provide funding. It was supposed to be an act of legal hygiene, a way to restore order to government bookkeeping. What it actually did was hand every future politician a procedural nuclear weapon. Suddenly, any faction in Congress could threaten to shut down the entire United States government simply by refusing to pass a budget. It was like discovering that your house had a self-destruct button hidden behind the thermostat. Nobody planned it. Nobody wanted it. But once everyone knew it was there, it was only a matter of time before someone desperate enough would decide to press it. The blame here isn't really on Civiletti. He was just interpreting existing law. The blame is on a system so absurdly complex that it accidentally created its own doomsday device and then forgot to put any safeguards on it. We built a government so bound by its own rules that we gave ourselves the power to turn it off just to prove we were following the manual. The weapon was now loaded and sitting on the table. All it needed was someone reckless enough to pick it up. That someone was Newt Gingrich in 1995. If 1980 created the weapon, 1995 was when someone finally decided to use it. Gingrich was the revolutionary Speaker of the House, facing off against President Bill Clinton in what would become the first great shutdown siege. The fight wasn't really about balancing the budget, despite what everyone claimed. It was about the fundamental role of government in American life. Gingrich and his Republican majority didn't want to trim federal spending. They wanted to systematically dismantle major parts of the welfare state. They passed a budget demanding massive cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, education, and environmental protection. Clinton held the veto pen and wasn't budging. So Gingrich deployed the new weapon. He refused to fund the government. Not for a day or a weekend, but for 21 excruciating days just before Christmas. It was legislative warfare. Starve the castle until the king surrenders. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers were sent home without pay. Veterans' benefits were delayed. The Statue of Liberty was closed to confuse tourists who'd planned their trips months in advance. The entire apparatus of the federal government was held hostage to force policy changes that couldn't pass through normal democratic processes. Sound familiar? It should. The 2025 shutdown is using the exact same playbook, just with higher stakes and more sophisticated political theater. The great irony of 1995 is that it backfired spectacularly. Public opinion turned hard against the Republican Congress. They were seen as extremist hostage-takers. Clinton emerged as the reasonable adult trying to keep the government functional. The lesson should have been crystal clear. Don't do this. The American people hate it, and you will lose. But that's not the lesson politicians actually learned. They didn't conclude that the weapon was too dangerous to use. They concluded that they needed to get better at aiming it. 17 years passed. The shutdown weapon sat in its holster like some dark relic of the 90s. Then came 2013 and everything changed again. If 1995 was a siege, 2013 was a vendetta. The battlefield was completely different this time. The fight wasn't about balancing budgets or the size of government. It was about destroying a single piece of legislation that had already become law. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. A new, more ideological wing of the Republican Party, led by figures like Senator Ted Cruz, saw an opportunity. They believed the health care law was an existential threat to American freedom, and they were willing to shut down the country to kill it. The demand was simple and unprecedented. Defund this law, or we turn off the government. President Obama, unlike Clinton, refused to even pretend to negotiate. He called it what it was: ransom. For 16 days, the federal government vanished. World War II veterans who'd been flown to Washington on honor flights found barricades blocking access to their own memorial. Scientists at the National Institutes of Health had to turn away new patients for clinical trials, including children with cancer. This was the point of no return. The 1995 shutdown was at least theoretically about fiscal policy. It was a brutal fight over the size and scope of federal government. The 2013 shutdown was about nullification. It was a way for a political minority that had lost every democratic battle to try winning the war by taking the entire government hostage. They weren't trying to negotiate a compromise. They were trying to override the normal constitutional process through economic terrorism. The law they wanted to destroy had passed Congress, been signed by the president, survived multiple court challenges, and been upheld by the Supreme Court. None of that mattered. The shutdown weapon was now powerful enough to override democracy itself. The public was appalled again. The blame fell squarely on the hostage-takers again. But the lesson they learned was even more perverse than before. It wasn't that they'd lost, it was that they hadn't gone far enough. By 2018, the pretense was over entirely. President Trump's shutdown wasn't about deficits or laws or constitutional principles. It was about a wall. $5.7 billion in funding for a border wall that wasn't a national emergency, wasn't essential government infrastructure, and certainly wasn't worth furloughing 800,000 federal workers over Christmas. This was the complete weaponization of dysfunction. The shutdown was now totally divorced from fiscal responsibility. It had become pure political theater, a way for a single executive to hold his own government captive for a symbolic victory. And it became the longest shutdown in American history at the time. 35 days of grinding, pointless suffering. Coast Guard members were forced to work without pay while lining up at food banks. Air traffic controllers worked for weeks without paychecks until they finally started calling in sick en masse, threatening to shut down the entire aviation system. The shutdown didn't end because anyone came to their senses. It ended because the weapon had become so powerful it threatened to bring down the entire economy. Flights were being canceled. The gears of commerce were seizing up. The hostage-taking had worked so well, it was about to kill the hostage. Which brings us to today. October 2025, day 40 of what is now the longest government shutdown in American history. This isn't a new crisis. It's the horrifying logical conclusion of everything that came before. Look at the pieces. It's a fight over healthcare policy, just like 2013. Democrats are refusing to pass any funding bill unless Republicans agree to extend expiring healthcare subsidies. It's a siege, just like 1995. The Democratic minority in the Senate is using the filibuster as their weapon, blocking any funding that doesn't meet their policy demands. And it's happening under a president who proved in 2018 that he's willing to absorb unlimited political damage while waiting for the other side to break. The blame this time is everywhere. It's a perfect circle of institutional failure. Democrats are holding the government hostage for a policy goal. Republicans are refusing to negotiate, calling it ransom. The president is letting everything burn, confident that voters will blame someone else. This is the weapon perfected. It's no longer a desperate last resort. It's become a routine political tool, as normal as campaign ads or Senate filibusters. Everyone knows the rules. Everyone knows exactly which federal workers to furlough for maximum political impact. Everyone knows how to time the pain for maximum media coverage. The greatest trick of the 2025 shutdown is that it's convinced everyone this is just normal American governance now. But there's a victim in all this that nobody talks about. Something invisible, but absolutely essential. Something that once lost might never come back. Trust. Trust in institutions. Trust that the government is a stable, reliable entity. Trust that the world's reserve currency is backed by a nation that isn't fundamentally broken. Trust that America is a serious country run by serious people. Every shutdown shaves a little more silver off the coin. In ancient Rome, they gradually debased their currency until a denarius went from 95% pure silver to 50% to 5% to just bronze with silver plating. The coin was still called a denarius, but the trust was gone. The empire of money collapsed long before the barbarians showed up. This is what we're doing to ourselves. Every shutdown tells the world that our political disagreements matter more than basic governance. It tells our allies we're unreliable. It tells our enemies we're a house divided. It tells our own citizens that the system is a joke. This is how empires really die. Not in glorious battle, but in slow, grinding, pathetic loss of institutional credibility, and the financial cost is staggering. The 2013 shutdown cost an estimated $24 billion. The 2018-2019 tantrum cost around $11 billion, with roughly $3 billion permanently destroyed. Just gone. Vaporized for absolutely nothing. The current 40-day marathon has already wiped out billions in economic output. By the end of October 2025, the Congressional Budget Office was estimating at least $7 billion in lost growth, with more damage compounding every single day this drags on. That's the price of an F-35 fighter jet every few hours. The entire budget of the National Cancer Institute, over and over again. The combined salaries of every firefighter, police officer, and EMT in America burned on the altar of political brinkmanship. All incinerated because grown adults can't figure out how to fund their own government. While politicians argue about media coverage, the CDC has stopped or scaled back tracking disease outbreaks. Food safety inspections have ground to a halt. Tens of millions of Americans on food assistance are staring at empty government assistance offices and looming benefit interruptions. So who's actually to blame for this disaster? The honest answer is everyone. Blame the lawyers in 1980 who accidentally created a doomsday weapon while trying to clean up government bookkeeping. Blame the ideologues of 1995 and 2013 who proved that hostage-taking works. Blame the president in 2018 who showed that the pain never reaches the top. Blame every politician in 2025 who treats governance like a reality show. But most of all, blame the system itself. A system that's normalized the idea that to win a policy argument, you must first be willing to destroy the country. The shutdown weapon has become so routine, so accepted, that we've forgotten how absolutely insane this is. No other developed democracy does this. When the British Parliament can't agree on a budget, the government doesn't shut down. When the German Bundestag hits an impasse, federal workers don't get furloughed. When the Japanese diet faces political deadlock, cancer research doesn't stop. Only America has given itself this particular form of political suicide. Only we've decided that the appropriate response to legislative disagreement is to turn off the government and see who blinks first. A government shutdown isn't a negotiation tactic. It's a declaration of institutional failure. It's the political equivalent of burning down your own house to win an argument with your neighbor. In the end, it doesn't matter who's technically to blame. What matters is who pays the price. And that's always the same people. The cancer researchers, the air traffic controllers, the Coast Guard families, the food safety inspectors. The ordinary Americans who need their government to actually function. The politicians who create these crises never suffer the consequences. They keep getting paid. Their health care never stops. Their offices stay open. They've designed a system where they can inflict maximum pain on everyone else while remaining completely insulated from the damage they cause. History doesn't repeat, But it sure does send us the bill for not learning our lessons. And this bill is getting expensive. The question isn't whether we can afford another shutdown. The question is whether American democracy can survive this many more demonstrations of its own incompetence. The weapon is loaded. Everyone knows how to use it, and nobody seems interested in putting it away. Welcome to the new normal, where the most powerful country in human history can't figure out how to keep its own lights on. The next time someone tells you this is just politics as usual, remind them that usual doesn't have to mean completely insane. We chose this. We built this system, and we can choose to fix it. But first, we have to stop pretending that any of this is normal. Because it's not normal. It's a sign of a failing state, and failing states don't stay superpowers for very long. If you want more deep dives that actually connect the political circus to the real-world damage it causes, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. At the very least, you'll understand what's happening long before the people in charge admit it.